As a little girl, I looked up to my father, way up, because he was a tall, tall man. My daddy was taller than any other daddies in our neighborhood. He had these long arms that would reach up and they could grab things off the tallest shelves in the kitchen. And he had these long, long legs that he had to fold up to get in and out of our car. I was sure that he was the strongest man on earth. He had these muscles that he could make pop up on his arms. And when he made those muscles jump around, the hula girls tattooed there danced. He wasn't always around because my daddy worked hard. He always worked hard, even when he was a little boy. He said all of the kids in the family had to work because there were 19 of them. And that was a lot of mouths to feed. He told the story about the Sunday that the preacher came for supper. Now, all the kids had been warned ahead of time that no one was to be taking the last piece of chicken. That would be for the preacher. Well, soon there was only one piece of chicken left on that platter. And suddenly the lights went out. And when they came back on, there was that piece of chicken in the preacher's hand, 19 forks in the back of it. I could not even imagine all the cousins I had. And it was hard to keep track of all my aunts and uncles. Uncle Jim was the oldest, and then there was Other, Edgar, JD. They just threw initials in for some of those kids. There was Thelma and Lucy, Orrin, Jesse, CB, that was my daddy, Grady, Amanda Lee, Edna May, Ari, Walter, Dee, Dodie, Carl, and Dudley was the last one. And Grandpa King moved that family all around Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas. Daddy said it got to where all they had to do was just pull that old truck in front of the house, and chickens would lay down and cross their legs and wait to be tied up for traveling. And he said he never got to finish any one grade in any one school because they were either traveling or crops would come right for picking and those kids had to be out in the field. There's a picture of my daddy and my Aunt Daisy, just little kids, standing out in the middle of a cotton field. Aunt Daisy has on an old-fashioned sunbonnet, and they both have poke sacks slung over their little shoulders to hold the cotton they were picking. And they had to stay out in those fields in all kinds of weather. They had to keep working. Daddy said Grandpa King had a big wooden stake that he would take and pound into the field they were working in. And off of that post was a chain with big, heavy iron links. Now, if the wind was blowing hard enough, if it was storming hard enough that chain was out and kind of flutting around in the wind, that's when the kids knew they could come in out of the weather. By the time I was 15, I had figured out long since that my daddy just told tall tales. I wanted him to stop telling stories and just talk to me like I'd heard my friends' fathers talking to them. He wasn't always around. It was 1965 and he was still working hard. He was the roofing contractor in town. He liked listening to Hank Williams better than the Beatles, but my sister and I still thought he was pretty groovy because we seen him driving his pickup truck through town, flashing the peace sign. It wasn't until many, many years later that we figured out he wasn't flashing the peace sign. He was just giving that friendly country hey wave. But that peace sign, two fingers raised up in a V pattern, it had spread throughout the hippie culture and legend in the 60s. It just took off. And it stood for freedom, or not freedom, but for peace. And peace was of prime importance to this movement that gave birth during the Vietnam War. All of those high school kids and college kids and all of those hippies, they were so immersed in this movement that it actually created a gap between these peace-loving youngsters and the mainstream. And it was as if two different languages were being spoken. And that's how I felt with my father. And I so wished that I could find the right language, the right words to talk to him about the Vietnam War, about how important peace was. He had served in the Navy during World War II, but he never told those stories. We went to visit my Granny King one Sunday. She was just a little bitty woman who liked to do the twist at inappropriate times and places. But that little woman had a heart that was so big. It held so much love for each and every one of her many, many, many grandchildren. And so I was sitting beside her on the couch as she and my father visited. Daddy asked her if she remembered that winter in Oklahoma that was so cold, the chickens froze to death sitting by the fireplace. I rolled my eyes, but I held my tongue. Tall tales, tall tales. But my Granny King, she reached over and patted me and nodded and said, "Yep, I remember. I recall that house. I recall that winter. It was so cold. And there were so many holes, so many chinks in that house that those poor birds froze to death, sitting right there by the fire." My eyes stopped rolling and my mouth fell open. Oh, my Granny King didn't lie. That story was true. I quickly started going through all the stories that my father had told me over the years, all those stories that I believed when I was a little girl, all the stories that I'd since discarded as tall tales and exaggerations, the stories that I'd stopped listening to because I knew they were just made up, the stories I knew he told just to keep from really talking to me. And now I was going to have to do a whole refiguring and sort out what parts of those stories were true.
Mm.
I learned to listen more carefully to my father's stories, and I tried hard to find what I needed there. You see, I knew he loved me, but he could just never seem to say, "I love you," out loud. As a grown woman, I came to realize that my father was really a very shy man, and story was how he communicated. And I found peace in that. I'd grown, but that tall, tall man was now bent over into a stooped question mark in the van. His hula girls were older too. They were all wrinkly and no longer danced. He had Alzheimer's and was slowly disappearing into another world,
Mm.
but he was still working hard, trying to keep those shadows from creeping in. I sat down beside him one day. "Hey, Daddy." He didn't respond. He was off in another place. And so I started telling him a story. "Hey, Daddy, did you ever hear that story about that old mule that was standing out in a cornfield one summer day? Oh, it was a hot day. It was so hot that that corn started popping. And that mule was so stupid. He thought that popcorn was snow. And he started shivering and shaking and fell over, froze to death." My father slowly turned and faced me. He blinked a couple of times, smiled, and said, "Where'd you hear that story?" "From you, Daddy. From you," the tall tale man.